Imagine losing everything at 55 years old. Your business, your home, your life savings, and even the trust of the people you love most. And then discovering that this devastating loss was actually the beginning of your greatest adventure. Hello, my dear friends. It's always such a pleasure to be here with you, sharing these stories that touch our hearts so deeply. You know, after so many years of living, I've learned that the most extraordinary people are often those who face the most difficult battles and somehow found the courage to keep going. I'm Rose Thompson, and I've been collecting and sharing these beautiful stories of human resilience for years now. Each one teaches us something profound about the strength of the human spirit, and today's story is no exception. It comes from Margaret Sullivan, though everyone calls her Maggie. She's 64 years old from Minneapolis, Minnesota, and she's divorced. Maggie's story is one of the most powerful examples I've ever encountered of how our greatest failures can become our most beautiful beginnings. Before we dive into Maggie's incredible journey, I want to ask you to do something for me. If this story touches your heart, and I promise you it will, please give this video a thumbs up. It helps more people find these inspiring stories when they need them most. And if you're not already subscribed to our channel family, please hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, so you'll be the first to know when we share new stories of hope and transformation. I also encourage you to stay with me until the very end, because what Maggie discovered about herself will absolutely move you to tears. But they'll be tears of joy and inspiration. And don't leave a comment yet, but when this story's over, I'd love to hear your thoughts about resilience and second chances. Your words of encouragement could be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. But before we begin today's story, I always like to share something special with you that might help. I've left some wonderful natural products in the description that have been such a blessing in my life and might help you too. These are products I personally use and recommend for various health concerns like sleep, joint comfort, energy, and overall wellness. During times of stress and major life changes, like what Maggie experienced, our bodies need extra support. Just click the link in the description to learn more and support our channel family. Now, let me take you back to 2015 to a beautiful suburban neighborhood in Minneapolis, where Maggie Sullivan was living what many would consider the American dream. Picture this: a stunning colonial-style home with a perfectly manicured lawn, a circular driveway with 2 luxury cars gleaming in the Minnesota sunshine, and inside, a woman who had built an empire from absolutely nothing. Maggie wasn't born into wealth or privilege. She grew up in a working-class family, where her father worked double shifts at a factory, and her mother cleaned houses to make ends meet. But Maggie had something special: a fierce determination and an intuitive understanding of people that would serve her well in the business world. After graduating from college with a degree in psychology, she worked for several human resources companies, learning the ins and outs of corporate culture, employee relations, and business dynamics. In 1995, at the age of 35, Maggie made a bold decision that would change her life forever. She took her modest savings, maxed out her credit cards, and started Sullivan HR Consulting from her kitchen table. Those early days were grueling, my dear friends. She would work 18-hour days, cold calling businesses, creating proposals, and slowly building a reputation for excellence in human resources consulting. I remember my own early days trying to build something from nothing, and I know that mixture of terror and excitement that keeps you awake at night. You're constantly wondering if you're making the right choice, if you're brave enough or smart enough to succeed. But Maggie had that special quality that I've seen in so many successful people. She wasn't afraid to fail spectacularly, as long as she was moving forward. For 20 years, Maggie's business grew steadily. She specialized in helping medium-sized companies navigate complex HR challenges, from workplace harassment issues to large-scale restructuring. Her approach was unique because she combined her psychology background with practical business sense and genuine compassion for both employers and employees. Companies loved working with her because she didn't just solve problems, she prevented them. By 2015, Sullivan HR Consulting employed 12 people and generated over $2 million in annual revenue. Maggie had achieved everything she'd dreamed of as that young woman working from her kitchen table. She owned her dream home outright, had substantial savings, and had even helped her elderly parents buy a comfortable retirement condo in Florida. But success, as I've learned in my own life, can sometimes make us complacent. We start to believe we're invincible, that we've figured out the secret formula for success. Maggie was about to learn one of life's hardest lessons, that everything we think is permanent can disappear faster than we ever imagined possible. The first crack in Maggie's perfect world appeared in early 2015, when her business partner of 10 years, David Chen, suggested they should expand aggressively. David had been with Maggie since the early days, and she trusted him completely. He was like the younger brother she'd never had, smart and ambitious, and he'd helped her navigate many business challenges over the years. David's proposal was ambitious but seemed logical. He wanted to open offices in 3 new cities, hire 20 additional consultants, and target Fortune 500 companies instead of their usual mid-sized clients. The expansion would require significant investment, about $800,000. But David assured Maggie that he'd already secured verbal commitments from several major corporations. Looking back, Maggie can see all the red flags she missed. David was vague about the details of these supposed contracts. He was evasive when she asked to speak directly with the potential clients. He pressured her to make quick decisions, saying they'd lose the opportunities if they waited. But Maggie wanted to believe in the dream he was painting. A dream of building a regional consulting empire that would secure their financial futures forever. Against her better judgment, and against the advice of her attorney and accountant, Maggie agreed to the expansion. She mortgaged her paid-off home, borrowed against her retirement accounts, and even convinced 3 major clients to provide upfront payments for long-term consulting contracts. In total, she invested nearly $1.2 million of her own money and committed resources into David's expansion plan. For 6 months, everything seemed to be progressing smoothly. They signed leases on new offices, hired staff, and David reported regular progress on securing the big contracts. But by late 2015, Maggie started noticing troubling signs. The promised Fortune 500 contracts hadn't materialized. Their existing clients were expressing concerns about service quality as the company struggled to manage its rapid growth. And David seemed increasingly stressed and distant. The day that changed everything was December 15th, 2015. I remember dates like this in my own life. Those moments when the entire trajectory of your future shifts in an instant. Maggie arrived at the office that morning to find David's assistant crying at her desk. When Maggie asked what was wrong, the young woman handed her a letter. David was gone. Not just gone from the office, completely gone. The letter explained that he'd been embezzling money from the company for over 2 years, using funds meant for business operations to support a gambling addiction that had spiraled completely out of control. The expansion money, the client prepayments, even the company's operating budget. It was all gone. David had fled to parts unknown, leaving behind nothing but debts and devastation. In that moment, standing in her office holding that letter, Maggie felt her entire world collapse around her. You know that feeling when you get devastating news and your body just goes numb? when reality becomes so overwhelming that your mind simply can't process it. That's where Maggie was. 20 years of building, dreaming, and working had evaporated in an instant. The next few weeks were a blur of lawyers, accountants, and creditors. Maggie learned that not only had David stolen the expansion money, but he'd also forged her signature on several additional loans and credit lines. The company owed nearly $2 million to various creditors, and as the primary owner, Maggie was personally liable for most of it. Her attorney was blunt. "Maggie, you have two choices. File for bankruptcy immediately and try to protect some of your personal assets, or fight this and lose absolutely everything." The bankruptcy would still mean losing her business and most of her savings, but she might be able to keep her home and some retirement funds. But even bankruptcy wasn't enough to save her. As the investigation continued, more of David's deceptions came to light. He'd been promising client services they couldn't deliver and had created phantom contracts to justify his spending. Several clients were now suing the company for breach of contract and fraud, even though Maggie had known nothing about David's lies. By March 2016, just 3 months after discovering David's betrayal, Maggie had lost everything. Her business was closed, her employees had been laid off, her home was in foreclosure, and her retirement accounts were emptied to pay creditors. At 55 years old, she found herself facing a future she'd never imagined possible. I want you to imagine, my dear friends, what it feels like to go from financial security to complete ruin in a matter of months. Think about having to explain to your adult children that their inheritance is gone, that the family home where they grew up will be sold to strangers. Picture having to call your elderly parents and tell them you can no longer help with their expenses. This wasn't just financial devastation. It was the complete destruction of Maggie's identity as a successful businesswoman and provider. The day Maggie handed over the keys to her beautiful home was one of the darkest of her entire life. She stood in the empty living room, remembering all the Christmas mornings, birthday parties, and family gatherings those walls had witnessed. Her daughters, Jennifer and Sarah, were barely speaking to her, unable to understand how their capable, successful mother had made such catastrophic mistakes. With just 2 suitcases and about $3,000 to her name, Maggie moved into a studio apartment in a much less desirable part of Minneapolis. The apartment was tiny, with thin walls, outdated appliances, and a view of a busy highway. But it was all she could afford, with her damaged credit and non-existent income. That first night in the studio apartment, lying on an air mattress because she couldn't afford real furniture, Maggie cried harder than she'd ever cried in her life. Not just for what she'd lost, but for the person she thought she was. She'd always been the strong one, the problem solver, the person others came to for advice. Now she felt like a complete failure, someone who'd been too naive and trusting to protect everything she'd worked for. You know, dear friends, I've learned that some of life's most important lessons come wrapped in our deepest pain. When everything we think defines us is stripped away, we're forced to discover who we really are underneath all the external markers of success. Maggie was about to begin a journey that would teach her the difference between having worth and knowing your worth. Please don't leave this video yet, because what Maggie discovered in her darkest moments will touch your heart in ways you can't imagine. Sometimes we need to hear about other people's struggles to understand that we're not alone in our own difficult times. The first year after losing everything was the longest year of Maggie's life. Every morning she'd wake up in that cramped studio apartment for a split second, forgetting where she was, still expecting to see the familiar master bedroom of her old house. Then reality would crash over her like a cold wave, and she'd have to force herself to get out of bed and face another day of a life she didn't recognize. Finding work at 55, with a recent bankruptcy and business failure on her record, proved to be far more challenging than Maggie had anticipated. The consulting world she'd dominated for 20 years suddenly felt closed to her. Former clients who'd once sought her advice were now embarrassed to be associated with her name due to the negative publicity from David's embezzlement and the subsequent lawsuits. After 3 months of sending out resumes and getting nothing but polite rejection letters, Maggie swallowed her pride and started applying for entry-level positions. At 55, she found herself competing with college graduates for jobs that paid a fraction of what she used to earn in a week. The interviews were humiliating experiences where she had to explain over and over again what had happened to her business, watching potential employers' expressions change from interest to pity to suspicion. Finally, in June 2016, Maggie got a job as a sales associate at Nordstrom department store. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd once shopped there regularly, buying expensive suits for important client meetings. Now she was folding those same suits and helping other successful women try on the kinds of clothes she could no longer afford. The job paid $12 an hour, which meant Maggie was earning in a month what she used to make in a day. After taxes, rent, and basic living expenses, she had maybe $50 left each month for anything beyond absolute necessities. Groceries became a careful calculation of dollars and cents. She learned to shop at discount stores, clip coupons, and make meals from whatever was on sale. But the financial struggle, difficult as it was, wasn't the hardest part of Maggie's new reality. The hardest part was the complete loss of her social world and family relationships. Her daughters, Jennifer and Sarah, were both in their late 20s with young families of their own. They'd grown up accustomed to their mother's success and the security it provided. When Maggie could no longer help with their children's college funds or provide the generous birthday and Christmas gifts they'd come to expect, they became increasingly distant and resentful. Jennifer, the older daughter, was particularly harsh. "Mom, how could you be so stupid?" she said during one painful phone conversation. "How could you trust David with everything without checking? You always taught us to be responsible with money, and then you go and lose our entire family's future because you were too naive to see what was right in front of you." Those words cut deeper than any financial loss ever could. Maggie had always prided herself on being a good mother, on teaching her daughters about independence and strength. Now she felt like she'd failed them in the most fundamental way possible. The respect and admiration she'd seen in their eyes for so many years had been replaced by disappointment and shame. Her social circle disappeared almost as quickly as her bank account. Friends who'd enjoyed expensive dinners and weekend trips together suddenly had scheduling conflicts whenever Maggie tried to make plans. At first, she attributed it to their busy lives, but gradually she realized that her changed circumstances made them uncomfortable. They didn't know how to relate to this new version of Maggie, the one who couldn't afford to split expensive restaurant bills or contribute to group gifts. The isolation was devastating. Maggie would go days without having a meaningful conversation with anyone except customers at the store. Evenings in her studio apartment stretched endlessly, filled with nothing but her own thoughts and regrets. She'd replay the decisions that led to her downfall over and over again, each time finding new ways to blame herself for being foolish, trusting, and naive. I understand this kind of isolation, my dear friends. There have been periods in my own life when loss made me feel completely cut off from the world I once knew. It's a special kind of loneliness that comes not just from being alone, but from feeling like you no longer belong anywhere. You become a stranger to your own life, unsure of who you are or what your purpose might be. The depression that settled over Maggie during this time was unlike anything she'd ever experienced. She'd read about depression, of course, and had even helped employees deal with mental health challenges in her consulting work. But experiencing it firsthand was completely different. It wasn't just sadness. It was a gray fog that made everything feel pointless and exhausting. Getting up in the morning became a monumental effort. The simple tasks that once felt automatic, showering, getting dressed, eating meals, required conscious decision-making and willpower. At work, she'd paste on a smile for customers, but inside she felt hollow and disconnected from everything around her. There were nights when Maggie seriously considered whether life was worth continuing. Sitting in her tiny apartment, looking at the bills she couldn't pay, and thinking about the children who barely spoke to her anymore, she wondered if everyone would be better off without her. The life insurance policy she'd managed to keep would at least provide something for Jennifer and Sarah, maybe help repair some of the financial damage she'd caused. It's painful for me to share this part of Maggie's story, but I think it's important because so many people who face major losses go through these dark thoughts. The shame and self-blame can become so overwhelming that ending the pain seems like the only option. If you're listening to this and recognizing these feelings in your own life, please know that you're not alone, and please reach out for help. These feelings pass, even when it seems impossible that they ever will. What saved Maggie during this darkest period was an unexpected friendship that began in the most ordinary way. Elena Vasquez was a 72-year-old woman who worked part-time at Nordstrom, mostly for the employee discount and social interaction, rather than financial necessity. She'd been watching Maggie during those first difficult months, noticing the sadness behind her professional demeanor and the careful way she counted her money during lunch breaks. Elena had the kind of intuitive wisdom that comes from living through many decades of both joy and hardship. She'd raised 6 children as a single mother after her husband died in Vietnam, had survived her own financial crises, and had learned to recognize the particular kind of grief that comes from losing everything you thought defined you. One rainy Thursday afternoon in October 2016, during their break, Elena approached Maggie in the employee break room. Maggie was sitting alone, staring at a cup of coffee she'd made with hot water and a packet of instant coffee she'd brought from home because the machine coffee cost $2. Mija, Elena said, using the Spanish term of endearment that means, my daughter. I've been watching you, and I see myself 30 years ago. Would you like to have coffee with me sometime? Real coffee, not this sad stuff you're making for yourself. Maggie looked up, surprised by the kindness in Elena's voice. She'd been so focused on her own misery that she hadn't really paid attention to her coworkers as individuals. Elena had a gentle face lined with smile wrinkles, silver hair pulled back in a neat bun, and eyes that seemed to hold decades of stories. I don't really have money for coffee out, Maggie said quietly, embarrassed to admit her financial situation to someone she barely knew. Elena smiled. I'm buying. And besides, the best conversations happen over kitchen table coffee anyway. Why don't you come to my house Saturday morning? I make excellent café con leche, and I have a feeling we have a lot to talk about. That Saturday morning changed the trajectory of Maggie's life, though she couldn't have known it at the time. Elena lived in a modest but comfortable house in an older Minneapolis neighborhood. The kitchen was the heart of the home, filled with the aroma of cinnamon and coffee, family photos covering every surface, and a sense of warmth that Maggie hadn't felt in months. As they sat at Elena's small kitchen table sipping the best coffee Maggie had tasted since her financial collapse, Elena began to share her own story. In 1989, when Elena was 45, her husband of 25 years left her for a younger woman, taking most of their savings and leaving her to raise their youngest 3 children alone. She'd had to sell their house, move to a small apartment, and work 2 jobs just to keep food on the table. I thought my life was over, Elena said, refilling their coffee cups. I'd been a housewife since I was 20. I didn't have job skills, I didn't have confidence, and I felt like such a fool for trusting a man who could abandon his family so easily. For 2 years I was so angry and bitter that I could barely function. Maggie felt tears welling up in her eyes as she listened. Here was someone who understood the particular pain of having your life destroyed by someone you trusted completely. How did you get through it? She asked. Elena smiled. One day at a time, Mija. One small choice at a time. And by learning that losing everything I thought I needed taught me what I actually needed. But we'll talk about that more next week. Right now, I just want you to know that you're not alone anymore." As Maggie walked back to her studio apartment that afternoon, she felt something she hadn't experienced in months, a tiny spark of hope. Not hope that her old life would return, but hope that maybe, just maybe, there could be a different kind of life ahead. Elena had looked at her not with pity or judgment, but with understanding and genuine care. That weekly coffee became the anchor of Maggie's week. Every Saturday morning she'd drive to Elena's house, in the 10-year-old Honda Civic she'd bought with her last savings, and they'd spend hours talking over coffee and Elena's homemade pastries. Elena shared more of her own story, how she'd gone back to school at 47 to become a certified nursing assistant, how she'd learned to manage money in ways she'd never needed to before, and most importantly, how she'd discovered strength and capabilities within herself that she'd never known existed. Elena didn't just offer emotional support. She provided practical guidance. She taught Maggie about budgeting on a survival income, showed her where to find the best deals on groceries and household necessities, and helped her navigate the complex world of government assistance programs for people facing financial hardship. More importantly, Elena helped Maggie begin to separate her sense of self-worth from her financial status. "You are not your bank account," she would say repeatedly. "You are not your mistakes. You are not what happened to you. You are how you choose to respond to what happened to you." Slowly, very slowly, Maggie began to emerge from the deepest part of her depression. The gray fog didn't lift all at once, but Elena's friendship provided enough light for Maggie to start taking small steps forward. She began eating regular meals again, taking care of her appearance, and even occasionally smiling genuinely at work. But the real transformation was still to come. Neither Maggie nor Elena could have predicted that their Saturday morning coffee sessions were laying the foundation for something much bigger than either of them had imagined. Sometimes the most important moments in our lives happen quietly, in ordinary kitchens, over simple conversations between women who understand each other's pain. What do you believe she'll discover about herself through this friendship with Elena? I love reading your thoughts and predictions. They help me understand what resonates most with our channel family. The turning point in Maggie's life came during one of those Saturday morning coffee sessions in early 2017, about 6 months after she'd started visiting Elena. They were sitting at Elena's kitchen table as usual, but this morning felt different. Maggie had been sharing her frustration about a difficult customer at work, someone who'd been rude and dismissive, treating her like she was invisible. "You know what bothers me most?" Maggie said, stirring her café con leche thoughtfully. "It's not even the rudeness. It's that I used to be someone who commanded respect. I used to walk into boardrooms and have executives hang on every word I said. Now I fold clothes and get treated like I don't matter." Elena nodded, but then she said something that surprised Maggie completely. "Tell me about that boardroom version of yourself. What made you so good at what you did?" It was the first time in over a year that anyone had asked Maggie to talk about her professional skills as something valuable rather than something she'd lost. As she began describing her approach to human resources consulting, her voice changed. The confident, articulate businesswoman started to emerge from beneath the layers of shame and defeat. "I was good at seeing patterns," Maggie explained, becoming more animated as she spoke. "When companies called me in, they usually thought they had one problem: high turnover or harassment complaints or productivity issues. But I could see the underlying systems that were creating multiple problems. And I was really good at explaining complex solutions in ways that made sense to people at every level of the organization." Elena listened intently, asking thoughtful questions that drew out more details about Maggie's expertise. As Maggie talked, she realized something profound. Losing her business hadn't erased her knowledge or her natural abilities. The skills that had made her successful were still there, hidden beneath the grief and financial stress, but intact. "Mia," Elena said when Maggie finished describing a particularly complex corporate restructuring she'd managed, "do you hear yourself right now? Do you hear the confidence and wisdom in your voice when you talk about this work?" Maggie paused, suddenly aware that for the past hour, she'd felt like her old self, the competent professional who could solve complex problems and help people navigate difficult situations. It was the first time since David's betrayal that she'd accessed that part of her identity. "The woman who solved those problems," Elena continued, "she's still in there. She's been buried under hurt and shame, but she's still there. The question is, what is she going to do with all that knowledge and experience now?" That conversation planted a seed that would grow in ways neither woman expected. Over the following weeks, Maggie found herself paying closer attention to conversations around her. At work, she listened to her co-workers discussing their personal financial struggles. During her lunch breaks, she overheard customers talking about money worries, job insecurity, and retirement fears. What struck Maggie was how many people seemed to be struggling with basic financial literacy and planning. She heard stories of people in their 50s and 60s who had never learned to budget properly, who were terrified of retirement because they had no savings, or who were drowning in debt but didn't know how to address it systematically. One afternoon in March 2017, Maggie was working the fitting room area when she overheard a conversation between two women in their 60s. One was trying on interview outfits because she'd been laid off after 30 years with the same company and had no idea how to look for work in the modern job market. The other was offering sympathy, but admitting she was terrified about her own financial future after a difficult divorce. Without really thinking about it, Maggie found herself offering gentle suggestions. She helped the job-seeking woman understand how to present her experience as an asset rather than a liability in interviews. She gave the divorced woman some basic advice about rebuilding credit and creating a realistic budget on a fixed income. Both women were incredibly grateful for the advice, and Maggie realized she'd felt more useful and fulfilled in those 15 minutes than she had in months of folding clothes and processing returns. She'd forgotten how good it felt to help people solve problems and gain confidence in their abilities. That evening, Maggie called Elena and told her about the conversation. "I think I want to help people," she said. "Not in some big formal way, but just people who are going through what I went through. Financial crisis, starting over later in life, feeling like failures. I know what that feels like, and I know some things that might help." Elena's response surprised her. "Why not start small? What if you offered to help just one person organize their finances? See how it goes?" The first person Maggie helped was Maria, a co-worker at Nordstrom who was struggling to manage her budget as a single mother. Maria had been working retail for 15 years but was living paycheck to paycheck, unable to save anything for emergencies or her daughter's future education. She'd mentioned her financial stress to Maggie during a particularly difficult shift, and Maggie offered to help her look at her spending and create a realistic budget. They met at a coffee shop on their day off, and Maria brought 3 shoeboxes full of receipts, bills, and bank statements. Her financial records were in complete chaos, which reminded Maggie of some of the small businesses she'd helped in her consulting days. But instead of feeling overwhelmed, she felt energized by the familiar challenge of bringing order to chaos. Using skills she'd developed over 20 years of business consulting, Maggie helped Maria categorize her expenses, identify areas where she was overspending, and create a realistic monthly budget. More importantly, she helped Maria understand that financial planning wasn't about perfection. It was about making conscious choices and adjusting when life inevitably got messy. "I never realized how much money I was spending on little things," Maria said, as they worked through her receipts. $5 here, $10 there. It adds up to hundreds of dollars a month that I could be putting toward my daughter's college fund instead." But what touched Maggie most was Maria's response to the entire process. "You know what?" Maria said at the end of their session. "For the first time in years, I feel like I have some control over my money instead of it controlling me. You explained everything in a way that makes sense. And you didn't make me feel stupid for not knowing this stuff already. That feeling of helping someone gain confidence and control over their financial life was intoxicating for Maggie. It combined her natural problem-solving abilities with the hard-won wisdom she'd gained from her own financial catastrophe. She understood both the practical and emotional aspects of financial struggle in ways that traditional financial advisors often didn't. Word spread quickly among their co-workers about Maggie's budget session with Maria. Within a month, 3 other women had asked for similar help. Maggie found herself spending her weekends meeting with people at coffee shops and libraries, helping them organize their finances and create realistic plans for their futures. Each person she helped taught her something new about the particular challenges faced by people who were struggling financially. She worked with a divorced woman in her 50s who'd never managed money independently before. She helped a man nearing retirement who realized he'd never really understood his 401k options. She assisted a young mother who was drowning in student loan debt and had no idea how to prioritize her financial obligations. What Maggie discovered was that most people didn't need sophisticated investment advice or complex financial products. They needed someone to help them understand the basics, to create systems that worked with their real lives rather than some theoretical ideal. And most importantly, to do all of this without judgment or condescension. You know what makes you different from other financial people I've talked to. Ask Janet, a 58-year-old woman Maggie had helped create a debt repayment plan. You've been where I am. When you tell me it's possible to dig out of this mess, I believe you because you've done it yourself, and you don't make me feel ashamed for being in this situation in the first place. Elena watched this development with interest and pride. During their Saturday morning coffee sessions, she encouraged Maggie to think bigger about what she was doing. Mija, you're helping these people change their lives. You found your calling again, but it's different from what you did before. It's more personal, more meaningful. I don't know if it's a calling, Maggie replied. I'm just doing what feels natural, and it happens to help people. That's exactly what a calling is, Elena laughed. It's when your natural gifts meet the world's needs, and you can't imagine doing anything else. As spring turned to summer in 2017, Maggie realized that Elena was right. She was spending every free moment either helping people with their finances or thinking about better ways to help them. She'd started creating simple worksheets and guides to make the process easier. She was researching financial education programs and reading everything she could find about adult learning and financial psychology. The work didn't pay anything. Maggie was still living on her Nordstrom salary and struggling to make ends meet each month. But for the first time since losing her business, she felt like she had a purpose beyond just surviving. She was using skills she'd thought were lost forever, and she was making a real difference in people's lives. One evening in July, after helping a grandmother create a plan to pay off credit card debt so she could help with her grandchildren's college expenses, Maggie had a moment of stunning clarity. She was walking back to her car from the library where they'd met, and suddenly she understood something that had been building in her subconscious for months. Her financial catastrophe hadn't destroyed her professional value. It had enhanced it. The knowledge she'd gained from losing everything, combined with her existing business skills, made her uniquely qualified to help people facing similar challenges. Her failure had become her greatest credential. That night, she called Elena with excitement in her voice that her friend hadn't heard since before the bankruptcy. Elena, I think I know what I'm supposed to do next. I think I know how to turn this disaster into something beautiful. But before I tell you about Maggie's revelation, I want to remind you about those natural products I mentioned earlier. During times of major life transitions and stress, like what Maggie was experiencing, our bodies and minds need extra support. I've personally found that certain natural supplements can make a tremendous difference in maintaining energy and mental clarity during challenging periods. You'll find information about these products in the description below, and I encourage you to explore them if you're going through your own period of change and growth. Maggie's revelation that night was both simple and revolutionary. She realized that her experience of financial ruin, combined with her professional background in human resources and her newfound understanding of financial recovery, positioned her to help other people in ways that traditional financial advisors couldn't. "Elena," she said during their next Saturday coffee session, "I've been thinking about all the people I've helped over the past few months, and I see a pattern. They're not looking for someone to manage their investments or sell them insurance. They're looking for someone who understands what it feels like to be overwhelmed by money problems and can help them take control of their situation, step by step." Elena nodded thoughtfully. "And what are you thinking about doing with this realization?" "I want to start teaching financial recovery classes," Maggie said, the words tumbling out as the idea crystallized. "Not for people who want to get rich, but for people who are struggling to get by. People who've lost jobs, gone through divorces, faced medical bankruptcies, or made financial mistakes like I did. I want to teach them that it's possible to recover and rebuild, no matter how hopeless things seem." The idea felt both terrifying and inevitable. Maggie knew she didn't have the traditional credentials that financial advisors possessed. She didn't have fancy certifications or degrees in finance. What she had was something arguably more valuable: authentic experience of financial catastrophe and successful recovery, combined with practical skills for helping people organize their lives and solve complex problems. Elena's response was immediate and enthusiastic. "This is it, mija. This is what you're meant to do. But how will you start?" Maggie had been thinking about that question for days. "I want to start small, maybe at the community center or the library. Free classes for people who can't afford financial advice, but desperately need it. I'll teach them everything I've learned about budgeting, debt reduction, rebuilding credit, and most importantly, how to regain confidence in their ability to manage money." Over the next several weeks, Maggie threw herself into developing her curriculum with the same intensity she'd once brought to building her consulting business. She created workbooks, developed exercises, and designed a 6-week program that would take people from financial chaos to having a clear, manageable plan for their future. But more than just the practical aspects, Maggie understood that people dealing with financial crisis needed emotional support and encouragement. She designed her classes to address the shame, fear, and self-blame that accompany financial difficulties. She wanted people to understand that financial setbacks don't define your worth as a human being, and that recovery is possible at any age. Her first class was scheduled for September 2017 at the Minneapolis Public Library. Maggie had nervously posted flyers around the neighborhood, advertising "Financial Recovery for Real People," a free workshop series. She had no idea if anyone would show up. On the first evening, 15 people gathered in the library's small conference room. They were a diverse group: a recently divorced woman in her 50s, a man who'd lost his job after 20 years with the same company, a grandmother raising her grandchildren on a fixed income, a young couple drowning in student loan debt, and several others facing various financial challenges. What struck Maggie immediately was how relieved people seemed to be in a room with others who understood their struggles. So much of financial difficulty is isolating because it carries such stigma in our society. People feel ashamed of their money problems and hide them from friends and family, which only increases the stress and sense of hopelessness. "Before we talk about budgets or debt reduction," Maggie began the first session, "I want you to know that every single person in this room is dealing with financial challenges, and that doesn't make any of you failures. It makes you human beings living in a complex economic system that doesn't always work in our favor." She shared her own story: the success, the betrayal, the loss of everything, and the long journey back to stability. She was honest about the depression, the shame, and the moments when she'd wanted to give up entirely. She also talked about what she'd learned during the recovery process and how that knowledge had led her to want to help others. The response was immediate and emotional. Several people in the room began crying as they realized they weren't alone in their struggles. Others shared their own stories of financial setbacks and the isolation they'd experienced. By the end of that first session, the group felt like a support network, rather than just a class. Over the 6 weeks that followed, Maggie guided the group through every aspect of financial recovery. They learned to track their spending, create realistic budgets, prioritize debt payments, and negotiate with creditors. But more importantly, they learned to approach money management with compassion for themselves and confidence in their ability to improve their situations. The practical results were impressive. Maria, the co-worker who'd been Maggie's first unofficial client, had already paid off 2 credit cards and started an emergency fund. Janet had negotiated payment plans for her medical debt and was on track to be debt-free in 3 years. The young couple had restructured their student loans and created a plan to buy their first home within 5 years. But what moved Maggie most were the emotional transformations she witnessed. People who'd entered the class feeling hopeless and ashamed left feeling empowered and optimistic about their financial futures. They'd learned that financial recovery wasn't just about numbers and spreadsheets. It was about reclaiming control over their lives and their sense of self-worth. After the success of that first class, word spread quickly through the community. The library asked Maggie to teach another session, and then another. A local community center invited her to offer workshops there as well. Within 6 months, she was teaching multiple classes each week and had a waiting list of people wanting to attend. People started calling her the Second Chance Financial Lady, a nickname that made her smile every time she heard it. It perfectly captured what she was offering, not traditional financial advice for wealthy people looking to get wealthier, but practical, compassionate guidance for people who needed a second chance to get their financial lives on track. As 2018 began, Maggie realized that what had started as informal help for a few co-workers had evolved into something much more significant. She was regularly teaching classes, developing new materials, and consulting with individuals who needed more personalized help. People were referring friends and family members to her, and she was getting requests to speak at women's groups, senior centers, and other community organizations. For the first time since losing her business, Maggie began to think about her work as more than just a volunteer activity. She was helping dozens of people each month, and the demand for her services was growing rapidly. Maybe, just maybe, she could turn this passion into a sustainable business that would provide both income and purpose. The idea was both exciting and terrifying. Starting a new business at 58, with a bankruptcy in her recent past and limited savings, felt like an enormous risk. But Elena, ever the wise counselor, helped Maggie see it differently. "Mija, you're not starting from nothing this time," Elena pointed out during one of their Saturday conversations. "You're starting with wisdom you didn't have before, with a clear understanding of who you want to serve and how you want to serve them. And you're starting with something more valuable than money. You're starting with a community of people who believe in you and trust you." Elena was right. Unlike her first business, which she'd built primarily for financial success, this new venture was growing organically from genuine need and authentic connection. The people she served weren't just customers. They were a community of individuals supporting each other through financial recovery and personal growth. In March 2018, Maggie took a leap of faith that would have seemed impossible 2 years earlier. She reduced her hours at Nordstrom to part-time and began offering paid financial coaching services alongside her free community classes. She called her business Second Chance Financial Coaching and defined her mission as helping people rebuild their financial lives after setbacks, loss, or major life changes. Her services were specifically designed for people who couldn't afford the traditional financial advisors, but needed more support than generic financial education could provide. She offered one-on-one coaching, group workshops, and ongoing support programs, all priced to be accessible to people with limited incomes. The response was overwhelming. Within 3 months, she had a full client roster and a waiting list for her services. Her approach, combining practical financial skills with emotional support and the credibility of someone who'd survived financial catastrophe herself, filled a gap in the market that she hadn't even realized existed. But success this time felt completely different from her first business success. Instead of the competitive drive and ego satisfaction that had motivated her HR consulting work, this success was rooted in service and connection. Every client who paid off debt, built an emergency fund, or simply gained confidence in their ability to manage money felt like a personal victory for Maggie. "You know what I love most about this work," she told Elena during one of their Saturday coffee sessions. "I'm not selling people something they don't need or convincing them to spend money they don't have. I'm helping them take control of something that's been controlling them. I'm giving them tools and confidence to build better lives for themselves and their families." By the end of 2018, Maggie had served over 200 people through her classes and coaching programs. She'd moved out of her studio apartment into a comfortable one-bedroom place and was even beginning to rebuild her savings. More importantly, she'd rebuilt her sense of purpose and identity around work that felt meaningful and sustainable. The woman who'd lost everything just 3 years earlier had found something more valuable than the financial success she'd lost. She'd found a way to transform her greatest failure into her greatest gift to others. But Maggie's story was far from over. The foundation she'd built through this work would soon support changes in her personal life that she'd never dared to dream possible. You know, my dear friends, what I find most beautiful about this part of Maggie's journey is how she discovered that our deepest wounds can become the source of our greatest contributions to the world. Sometimes we have to lose everything we think we need before we can find what we're actually meant to do. Maggie's financial catastrophe didn't destroy her professional life. It redirected it toward work that was more meaningful and impactful than anything she'd done before. They were glad she was no longer the broken, depressed woman she'd been immediately after the bankruptcy, but they hadn't yet forgiven her for the financial mistakes that had cost them their sense of security. The breakthrough came in an unexpected way. In February 2019, Jennifer called Maggie for the first time in months, but it wasn't to reconcile. She was calling because she and her husband were facing their own financial crisis. Her husband had been laid off from his job in corporate marketing, and they were struggling to make their mortgage payments while supporting 2 young children. "Mom, I know things have been difficult between us," Jennifer said, her voice tight with stress and barely contained panic. "But Sarah told me about this financial coaching thing you're doing, and honestly, we don't know where else to turn. We can't afford a financial advisor, and we're scared we're going to lose our house." For Maggie, this phone call represented so much more than a business opportunity. This was her daughter, the little girl who used to help her organize papers in her home office, who'd been so proud to tell her friends that her mom was a successful businesswoman. Now Jennifer was asking for help in the very area where Maggie had once failed so spectacularly. "Of course I'll help you," Maggie said, her heart racing with both professional confidence and maternal anxiety. "But Jennifer, I want you to know that I'm going to approach this the same way I would with any client. I'm going to ask difficult questions and give you honest feedback, even if it's not what you want to hear. Can you handle that?" Jennifer's voice was small when she replied, "Mom, right now I'll take any help I can get." They met at a coffee shop the following Saturday, neutral territory that felt less emotionally charged than either of their homes. Maggie brought the same workbooks and worksheets she used with all her clients, determined to treat this as a professional consultation rather than letting family dynamics interfere with the practical work that needed to be done. As they went through Jennifer's financial documents, Maggie was struck by how much her daughter's situation reminded her of her own clients' challenges. Jennifer and her husband had been living slightly beyond their means for years, relying on dual incomes to support a lifestyle that included expensive daycare, car payments for 2 vehicles, and a mortgage that stretched their budget even when both of them were working. "The good news," Maggie said after reviewing everything, "is that this is absolutely manageable. You're not in nearly as dire a situation as you think you are. But you are going to need to make some changes to your spending, and you're going to need to get very intentional about your financial decisions." Over the next 2 hours, Maggie guided Jennifer through the same process she used with all her clients. They identified areas where spending could be reduced, created a bare-bones emergency budget that would allow them to keep their house while Jennifer's husband looked for work, and developed a plan for rebuilding their savings once he found new employment. But something magical happened during that session that went far beyond financial planning. As Maggie explained budgeting strategies and debt management techniques, Jennifer began to see her mother not as the person who'd made catastrophic mistakes, but as someone who'd learned from those mistakes and developed real expertise in helping people navigate financial challenges. "Mom," Jennifer said as they were packing up the paperwork, "I had no idea you knew all this stuff. I mean, I knew you were good at business before, but this is different. I don't know how to explain it, but you seem more confident and knowledgeable than you ever did when you had your old company." Maggie felt tears welling up in her eyes. "Losing everything taught me things I never could have learned any other way. I understand now what it feels like to be scared about money, to feel like you don't have control over your financial life. That experience, as painful as it was, made me a better teacher and coach than I ever could have been before." Jennifer was quiet for a moment, and then she said something that nearly broke Maggie's heart with its honesty. "I've been so angry at you for so long, Mom. I blamed you for trusting David, for not being more careful, for losing what I thought was my inheritance. But sitting here today, watching you help me figure out our mess, I realized that maybe losing all that money led you to something more important than money." That conversation marked the beginning of a new relationship between Maggie and her daughters. Over the following months, as Jennifer and her husband successfully navigated their financial crisis using the strategies Maggie had taught them, both daughters began to understand that their mother had become someone stronger and wiser through her ordeal. Sarah, who had been even more resentful than Jennifer, gradually came around as she watched her sister's financial recovery. Eventually, she asked for Maggie's help with her own money management, and those sessions became opportunities for them to rebuild their relationship on more adult, equal footing. "I think I understand now why you had to go through what you went through," Sarah told her mother during one of their financial planning sessions. "The mom who raised us was successful and confident, but she was also kind of, distant. Like success was more important than people sometimes. This version of you, the one who's been through hell and came out the other side, she's more real, more compassionate, more like someone I want to know as an adult." By the summer of 2019, Maggie had not only rebuilt her business and her relationship with her daughters, but she'd also begun to feel complete in a way she hadn't experienced since before her first marriage ended in divorce 15 years earlier. She was 59 years old, financially stable, professionally fulfilled, and emotionally reconnected with her family. Life felt good in a way that was deeper and more sustainable than the superficial success she'd enjoyed before her catastrophic losses. But life, as I've learned in my many years, has a way of surprising us with gifts we never thought to ask for. Maggie's next surprise came in the form of Robert Martinez, a 62-year-old widower who attended one of her financial recovery workshops in August 2019. Robert had lost his wife to cancer 2 years earlier and was struggling to manage finances that his wife had always handled during their 30-year marriage. He was a retired high school teacher with a modest pension, but he felt completely overwhelmed by investment decisions, insurance choices, and budgeting on a fixed income. What drew Maggie to Robert wasn't just his gentle manner and thoughtful questions during the workshop, but the way he treated everyone in the group with respect and kindness. He listened carefully to other people's stories, offered encouragement when appropriate, and never made anyone feel judged for their financial difficulties. After the workshop ended, Robert approached Maggie to ask about individual coaching sessions. "I know this might sound strange," he said, "but I feel like I need to learn to be financially independent for the first time in my adult life. My wife handled all our money matters, and I realized after she died that I never really understood how we afforded our lifestyle or what I needed to do to maintain it." Their first coaching session took place at a quiet cafe near Robert's home, and Maggie quickly realized that his financial situation was actually quite good. He had a reliable pension, adequate savings, and very few debts. What he lacked was confidence in his ability to make financial decisions and a clear understanding of his options for the future. As they worked together over several sessions, Maggie found herself looking forward to their meetings in a way that went beyond professional satisfaction. Robert was intelligent, curious, and appreciative of her guidance. He shared stories about his late wife, his adult children, and his career as a teacher with a warmth and openness that touched something in Maggie's heart that had been closed off for years. The turning point came during their fourth session in October 2019. They'd finished reviewing Robert's retirement planning options and were chatting over coffee when he said something that surprised them both. "Maggie, I hope this isn't inappropriate, but I want you to know that these sessions have given me more than just financial knowledge. They've given me hope that I can build a life for myself that honors my wife's memory while still being open to new experiences and relationships." Maggie felt her heart skip a beat. She'd been so focused on rebuilding her professional life and relationship with her daughters that she'd barely considered the possibility of romantic love at this stage of her life. But sitting across from Robert, seeing the kindness in his eyes and feeling the easy connection between them, she realized that her heart was more ready for love than her mind had been willing to acknowledge. "Robert," she said carefully, "are you asking me out on a date?" He smiled, and for a moment he looked like a nervous teenager rather than a 62-year-old widower. "I suppose I am. Would you like to have dinner with me sometime? Somewhere that doesn't involve financial planning worksheets?" Their first date was at a small Italian restaurant that Robert had chosen because his late wife had loved Italian food, and he wanted to honor her memory while also creating new experiences. They talked for hours about their lives, their losses, their children, and their dreams for the future. Maggie found herself sharing parts of her story that she'd never told anyone except Elena, not just the facts of her financial collapse, but the emotional journey of rebuilding her sense of self-worth and discovering new sources of meaning and purpose. Robert listened with the same attention and compassion he'd shown during their coaching sessions, but now she could see something more in his eyes: genuine affection and growing love. "You know what I admire most about you?" Robert said, as they were finishing dinner. "You took the worst thing that ever happened to you and transformed it into a way to help other people. That takes incredible courage and character." Their relationship developed slowly and thoughtfully, both of them aware that they were mature adults who'd experienced significant losses and needed to be careful with each other's hearts. But by the beginning of 2020, they were spending most weekends together, and Maggie had begun to envision a future that included love and companionship alongside her professional success and renewed family relationships. The year 2020 brought challenges that Maggie could never have anticipated, but it also brought confirmation of how solid the foundation of her new life had become. When the COVID-19 pandemic forced her to move her coaching business online, she discovered that her services were more needed than ever. People who'd lost jobs, faced medical expenses, or seen their retirement savings decimated by market volatility needed exactly the kind of practical, compassionate financial guidance that Maggie provided. Instead of being devastated by another economic crisis, Maggie found herself uniquely positioned to help people navigate financial uncertainty. Her experience of losing everything and rebuilding gave her clients confidence that recovery was possible, even in the most challenging circumstances. By the end of 2020, her business had actually grown during the pandemic. She was serving clients across the country via video calls, had developed online courses that reached hundreds of people, and had begun writing a book about financial recovery after major life setbacks. More importantly, the pandemic had deepened her relationship with Robert as they supported each other through lockdowns and uncertainties. In December 2020, he proposed to her during a quiet dinner at home, offering her a simple but beautiful ring that had belonged to his grandmother. "Maggie," he said, taking her hands across the small table in his kitchen, "I never thought I'd fall in love again after losing my wife. But you've shown me that it's possible to honor the past while still embracing new possibilities. Will you marry me and let me spend whatever years I have left supporting your dreams and sharing your adventures?" Through tears of joy, Maggie said yes, marveling at how this proposal felt completely different from her first marriage 40 years earlier. This wasn't about financial security or social expectations or building a conventional life together. This was about two people who'd both experienced loss and growth, choosing to share their wisdom, strength, and remaining years with each other. They married in a small ceremony in May 2021, surrounded by their children, a few close friends, and Elena, who had become like a mother to Maggie during her darkest years. Elena's speech at the reception captured something beautiful about Maggie's journey. "I met Maggie when she thought her life was over, when she believed she had nothing left to offer the world. Today I'm watching her celebrate not just a new marriage, but a completely new understanding of what it means to live a meaningful life." As I bring Maggie's story to a close, my dear friends, I want you to understand that this isn't just a story about financial recovery. This is a story about the incredible capacity of the human spirit to transform suffering into service, loss into wisdom, and despair into hope. Today, at 64 years old, Maggie runs a thriving financial coaching business that has helped over 1,000 people rebuild their financial lives after setbacks. Her book, Second Chance Money, A Guide to Financial Recovery After Loss, became a bestseller and has reached thousands more people who needed to hear her message of hope and practical guidance. She and Robert live in a comfortable home in Minneapolis, not far from the neighborhood where she once lived in her mansion. But this home feels different, warmer, more authentic, filled with the love of people who've learned that relationships matter more than possessions, and that purpose matters more than profit. Her daughters Jennifer and Sarah are now two of her closest friends and biggest supporters. They've learned to see their mother so not as someone who failed them financially, but as someone who showed them that it's possible to recover from any setback and build something more meaningful than what was lost. Every Saturday morning, Maggie still meets Elena for coffee, though now they alternate between Elena's kitchen and Maggie's dining room. These two women, who found each other in their darkest hours, continue to support and encourage each other as they navigate the joys and challenges of their golden years. "You know what I've learned, mija?" Elena said during a recent Saturday morning visit. "Life doesn't give us what we expect, but if we stay open and keep our hearts soft, it gives us what we need to become who we're meant to be." Maggie's response captured the essence of her transformation. 5 years ago, I thought losing everything was the end of my story. Now I realize it was actually the beginning of the most important chapter of my life. Before we finish today, I want to ask you to do something special for our channel family. If Maggie's story touched your heart, please hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you'll be notified every time we share a new story of hope and transformation. Stories like Maggie's remind us that no matter what challenges we're facing, there's always the possibility of a second chance, a new beginning, and a more meaningful life ahead. I'd also love for you to leave a comment below, sharing your thoughts about Maggie's journey, or perhaps your own story of overcoming setbacks and finding new purpose. Your words might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today, to keep going during their own difficult time. And remember those natural health products I mentioned earlier. During times of major life changes and stress, like what Maggie experienced, our bodies and minds need extra support to maintain energy, clarity, and emotional balance. I've left information about the natural supplements that have made such a difference in my own life in the description below. These products have helped me maintain my vitality and focus during challenging times, and they might help you too. My dear friends, Maggie's story teaches us that sometimes we have to lose everything we think we need before we can discover what we're actually meant to do with our lives. Her financial catastrophe wasn't the end of her story. It was the painful but necessary catalyst that led her to work that was more meaningful, relationships that were more authentic, and a life that was more purposeful than anything she'd experienced before. If you're going through your own difficult time right now, if you face setbacks that feel insurmountable, or if you're struggling to see how your current challenges could ever lead to something positive, I want you to remember Maggie's journey. Remember that our greatest failures can become our most powerful credentials for helping others. Remember that it's never too late to discover new purpose and meaning in life. And remember that sometimes the path to our most authentic selves leads directly through our deepest pain. Life has a way of breaking us open so that more light can get in. Maggie's story is proof that, on the other side of our darkest moments, there's often a life more beautiful and meaningful than anything we could have imagined when everything seemed lost. Until we meet again with another story of hope and transformation, this is Rose Thompson, reminding you that your story isn't over yet. The best chapters might still be waiting to be written. Thank you for sharing this time with me, and for opening your hearts to Maggie's incredible journey of loss, recovery, and ultimate triumph. May her story inspire you to believe in the possibility of your own second chances, no matter what age you are or what challenges you're facing. Keep your hearts open, my dear friends. The world needs the gifts that only you can bring, and those gifts are often discovered in the most unexpected places, sometimes even in the ashes of our greatest defeats.